back to my channel, and thank you so much for being here. Today we are talking all about powders. Now, all about really specifically setting the face and different techniques for each kind of skin type. So before we get going, hit that subscribe button, share this video with somebody you think might like it, and let's do it. So a very common question I get is usually, or a statement I get is, I really like how my foundation looks, or I really like how my tinted moisturizer looks, or I really like how my concealer looks, and then I put powder over it and it looks horrible. This is actually something that is totally common, and so I wanted to break it down 101 on different setting techniques for you guys and different products to use. So for me, as you know, I absolutely love a good glowing face. I love illuminizing powders. I am more normal to dry, so those type of powders really suit me. So for somebody like me, I'm going to do it by each technique or by each skin type, okay? So for somebody like me that is more normal to dry, as you saw in my video yesterday, I like to use a luminizing powder. So for me, the Ambient lighting powders from Hourglass. Again, I like to set my powders with my damp beauty blender or beauty sponge. Now, the dampness of your sponge really matters. You want to make sure that this is slightly damp. So really bring it out in the sink, bring it out in a towel, and go about doing your foundation, and then, you know, it'll basically be almost dry by the time you get to your powder. All right, so again, here is my ethereal light, and this is how I set my concealer. I take my sponge and I put it under my eyes, and I make a face, a weird makeup face, and I press it in. Now, with any powder that you use, you can use way too much. So it's very important to do a layering technique when you are using powder. So start off really with a light amount, and then you can kind of add on in those layers to get to the desired effect that you want. So for me, I just go like this and I tap under the eyes. Now I'm going to do that on the other side, but I'm going to show you on this side for somebody that is more normal to oily. For me, I would like to be a little bit glowier in the center of the face. So I normally would take my beauty blender right here, and I would go up and down the center of my face. But you don't have to do that. You can take the same powder or a different one. I have been known to quite a few times take a powder like this. So the Hourglass Mineral Veil powder. Now this is very different than the Ambient lighting powder. Yes, it's not going to make you look super dry, or it's not going to be super matte. It has a really nice natural shift to it, very similar to the Charlotte Tilbury powders, very similar to the CoverGirl illuminating powders that I talk about quite often. They have a little bit of a shift to it. I'm not talking glitter, I'm not talking a sheen, they just aren't super matte. They usually are mica based and not talc based, okay? Another great one to use is the Cover FX powder, the translucent Cover FX. It is one of my favorites. All right, so I'm going to take my powder and I'm going to put a little bit into the lid. So I have it in my lid, tap off excess. And now what you want to do is you just want to tap a small amount in to the face, and I'm just basically setting the face where I didn't use the other powder, and then you buff in. And what this does is it gives a nice finishing setting technique, and it doesn't leave you dry or overly powdered. Now, if that's great for you, then you're on to the rest of your routine. If you need a little bit more powder, say like in this area right here, just take, I like this brush by Sigma. It's the F25 tapered brush. I like to tap a little bit right here and then buff out. Again, pressure with this type of stuff is really important. You never want to be putting your powder on like this. Can you see I'm smushing the brush? You don't want to do that. I like a tapered brush because you are using the tip. Again, talking about brush control, my hand is in the middle of the brush, and you just tap and then you buff. Okay? So that's going to be a great way to approach how to powder your face if you are more of that normal to dry skin type. If you are more of that dehydrated, like super, you know you're dehydrated, skip powder completely. And for that matter, you can always skip powder completely. But I know a lot of you guys do like to set your foundation to keep it on a little bit longer, okay? So this is what I would recommend for that skin type. Now, if you are more oily to normal, so that obviously covers combination in there as well. For the most part, or talking in general terms, these skin types have a tendency to have larger pores right here, and right here, and right here. So really what you want to be careful of is overdoing illuminating powders in that area. You can, if you are more oily, combination, normal, you can of course wear the ambient lighting powders from Hourglass, but I would keep them away from sections of the face that have more pores, texture, things of that nature. So again, you can just take a similar powder like this. The RMS Unpowder is fantastic, and there's a whole bunch others, but one that is a little bit more mattifying, and you do the same technique. What you're going to do is you're going to mattify where you have the larger pores. Okay, so we're just going to kind of mattify in this area, and again, I'm tapping it, and then I'm going to buff it. And you see I'm going back in with little tiny amounts of powder. I'll show you how much I pick up. This is the amount of powder I pick up, and I usually give it a good little fling. I know it's kind of wasteful of product, but it works for me. And then what you can do is you can take your illuminizing powder, or you can use the same one all over the face. But I know some of my oily combination girls still like to be look dewy and glowy. So then take your this is diffused light by Hourglass, or whatever color matches you, and start to buff this in around the perimeter, just on the very perimeter. And that way you will get a more perfected section in the center of the face, and then a more luminous one on the outside perimeter of the face. All right, so let's talk about two more tips. Using your beauty blender to set your whole face. Now, the theory behind using a beauty blender to set with powder is that when the dampness of your sponge kind of comes into contact with your powder, it gives hydration back into the powder, and so when you push it into the skin, it doesn't give that powdery effect as much as it would if you would use a brush. Also, you will need a lot less when you use a sponge like this, and whenever you push it into the skin with the sponge, it's actually making the powder go in between that vellus hair, or in between any texture that you might have, or any pores that you might have, and it starts to push that into the skin, and so it looks a little bit more skin-like, okay? But you definitely can overdo the powder no matter what technique you do. So again, light layers is absolutely best, all right? So basically what I'm saying is that you can do that with a pressed powder. You can also do that with a loose powder, just like when we talked. Pick your favorite. It's not about products really in this video. So I'm going to show you. Here is my powder on my sponge, and I'm just going to, like, say, tap it in like this. And what you can do is you can just tap, 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 tap a little bit in all over the face. And then you can take your brush and buff it out, but usually it's better if you just kind of go over the section kind of quite a few times with a really light tapping motion, and it'll push that product in, and that powder in, and make it look more like skin. Now let's finally round this out with wrinkles and fine lines when you use powders. So for the most part, my mature community hates powders. I'm not a huge fan unless it's the ones that I've talked about, but it sometimes is essential to use a powder depending upon what you're doing. Now, if you have a little bit more fine lines, wrinkles, you can absolutely use a very refined, high quality product like the Hourglass Ambient Lighting Powders. They will not accentuate fine lines and wrinkles. They might accentuate, like we talked about, texture and pores, but they're not going to accentuate a wrinkle or a fine line. Actually, what they do is they give a blurring effect to it, and because the light shifts off of the powder itself, and so it does give a slight blurring effect to it. But if you want your best, in my opinion, if you are more normal to dry, use a damp beauty sponge. If you are more mature, that has little fine lines and wrinkles, press this around that area. And you don't want to just press and then be done. You want to really make sure you're making this a second skin. So you're pressing, pressing, pressing. My favorite one is either the Beauty Blender, but really honestly, the Real Techniques is bomb, okay? And it's so inexpensive, okay? So I hope that that makes sense. Now, if you are more oily to normal, more mature women, you can absolutely still use the sponge technique, okay? You don't have to necessarily just use a brush. You're gonna want to think about your powder selection, what kind of powder you're using if you are more of that skin type. It's really always about powder selection. You notice that I never really do a full setting of my face and then use a finishing powder. In my opinion, it just makes skin have more layers and it's just not necessary. But if you want to, you can. But if you are more mature, less is more with powders for sure, and really playing. You know, makeup is a lot about playing with different techniques and seeing what works best for you, because what works best for me might not be great for you. But I can say for 95% of my clientele is either, you know, much younger than myself or actually much older than myself, and I use a more of a sponge technique with my more mature clients as well as myself. So I hope that this helps you. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. It's going to be again about you playing with the different techniques, but there are no rules. So, you know, using a couple different powders to suit your needs or different techniques is totally acceptable. And I hope that you kind of try out these different techniques and see what works for you. So thanks again so much, and I'll see you on the next one. Lots of love from me to you. Bye.